Well, hey there, by 11. It's Mr. B again. This is going to be Plants Invade Land, Part 2, and this will be all about the Bryophytes and another group, another phylum that we call the Pterophytes. Now, the Bryophytes we saw in our previous lesson, and they were the mosses and the hornworts and the liverworts. Pretty simple, but they introduced a really important topic, which is alternation of generation, where something like ourselves, a diploid organism, would undergo a change to produce a second generation, which is called the Gametophyte generation, which produced the gametes and caused fertilization and caused the Sporophyte generation to be renewed, going around in a circle. That was a pretty important concept. You'll see that illustrated really well in Part 2 of Plants Invade Land. We're going to look, as I say, at the Bryophytes and the Pterophytes. The Bryophytes, we know, the mosses, hornworts, liverworts, and the Pterophytes, which will be sort of a new introduction, will be ferns. So we'll move on. We'll take a look at that. I've got some great stuff on the website, and I'll indicate what you need to look at and when. And I've got a couple of animations that I want to speak to in the course of the lecture. So here we go. All right, let's get reflection on here. And there we go. Make sure that you check out the animations on the site. I can't really indicate how important that is. I've searched sort of high and low for those over the years, and I highly recommend that you check them out. The ones that I show you in the lesson, that's one thing, but there's ones that I would have you go check out a little bit more yourself. So I'm going to pop into Dropbox, which is one of my favorites here. Here we go. And the little trick that I do is I download the lesson from Dropbox and then just do a screencast with it. You've probably noticed this by now, but it's a great trick and I'm going to stay with it. So let's annotate that and we're good to go. All right, branch fire. What do we got? Okay. So when we look at the Bryophytes, and we saw a little bit of this in previous lecture, they're using the same introductory image here. When I think of the Bryophytes, I think of the moss that we're seeing. Ooh, I better not choose green, hey? I think of the mosses that we're looking at here. And mosses in nature have a very important role. In fact, they produce a lot of soil. You see them growing on, you'll see them growing on things like stones, and they'll be right near water sources because they don't have plumbing. They don't have the ability to move water around inside themselves. If you think of plumbing in a house, it's exactly what it does. Moss is a short, stunty little bryophyte. It and the hornworts and liverworts, they have to stay in really low light areas so that they don't get dried out. Now, I know you might find them in your yard, right out in the open, but they are sponges and they can only really survive as long as they have fresh water. In fact, they can't reproduce without it. Because they don't have pipes, we say that they're not vascular. So when you see the term vascular, let's put a little annotation here in a different color because there's enough black on here already. We'll say that they have no H2O plumbing. That's not really developed until we get to something about like the ferns, phylum Pterophyta. So you can see in the images, they're very short and stunty. And in fact, I'll let you in on a little secret. What you're looking at here is the Gametophyte, or the 1N generation. It's haploid. Remember, having half the genetic set of information. Let's scroll over here for a second. There we go. And you'll see that they grow on rocks, and what they do, it's an interesting little trick. They have root-like structures underneath. They have these little things called rhizoids, and they get into the cracks, and they're trying to absorb moisture, but they're reaching and crawling and clawing, and what they do is they build up a little bit of pressure. And you got to remember that if they make a small crack in a rock, even the smallest of cracks, what will happen is that moisture can get in there eventually. There we go. Or from Harry Potter there, a little crackaroni in there. And what will happen is at night, in the morning, when ice crystals form, when water expands, when it freezes, it will actually chip away at the rock. So these guys and the formation of ice tend to break down or erode rock into soil. So they have a very important role. Depend on water for reproduction. We saw that. And we think of the ancestor of the bryophytes as being that green algae, that chlorophyte algae that you find in a lot of fresh water. Just look in your fish tank, you'll find lots of it. Now, when they say they draw up water by osmosis, osmosis is the flow of water from an area of low concentration to high. That's what happens when you get thirsty and you take a drink of water. The water spreads throughout your body and it goes through your cell membranes and it rehydrates you. Really what's happening is they're drawing up water. You can think of it in a sponge-like mechanism. That's not important. What you need to understand is that they themselves can't get very big because they can't move water around. Not like giant redwoods. When you think about a giant redwood out in the forest and it's hundreds of feet high, and you say, wow, that's an amazing tree, say 100, 150 feet high for the giant ones, and they can pump water. You think about how heavy water is, right? Water is 1 kilogram per liter. And a lot of big trees can move many liters of water up their stems. And if you stop and think about the physical challenge that represents, you can see that moving around water can be a real challenge. But just get a piece of paper towel wet and you'll see that the water just spreads right through it by capillary action. So 3 bryophytes that we saw the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts last time. So we won't go into detail about them again, except for mosses. I think they're the most important one to talk about. Mosses are definitely wet habitats, and what we're talking about in that case, you look at ponds, streams, rivers, even in my back lawn where it tends to be pretty moist, you'll find them doing quite well. And because they can live on rocks, think about it, that's the ultimate nutrient-poor soil. They're just trying to get a foothold. And they don't have true roots. They're very good at tolerating low temperatures. And those green, we saw this before, most of what you see when you look at a moss is a gametophyte. And they're growing together in sort of a large colony. It's very neat. So here you go. Everything you wanted to know about moss, but we're afraid to ask. If we go back to the core site just for a second, I want to show you something. So I'll just pop out of reflection for just a moment. If you look at this picture, and I put this up for a reason. 1, it was very pretty. 2, looks very cool. There's the Moss Gametophyte down there, growing on what looks like a rocky substrate. And then you look at these whiskers. Like, what are these things? They're not green. They don't appear to be photosynthesizing. How are those nutritive to the plant? Newsflash, what these things are is these produce the spores that regenerate this generation. And it's kind of neat. It really takes 2 halves to complete the life cycle. So now what we'll do, we'll pop out. See if I can zoom back out. There we go. We'll pop back into our mirroring and we'll look at that up close. So really it's 2 generations that you have here. You have the Sporophyte, which is something that, like us, can produce gametes, right? But in this case, I shouldn't say gametes. Let me back up. It can undergo meiosis, and what it can do is it can produce the thing that makes the gametes. That's more correct. The gametophyte plant. So this thing right here is our photosynthetic gametophyte, and it does most of the nourishing of the plant. It's in this a little hint here. The gametophyte generation is much more dominant. So we know that this is a female, and I'll tell you how you know, because it's only the female that has an egg that would lie there, that would get fertilized by 2 sets of gametes. So an egg and a sperm. So we'll draw a little spermie coming in from a male. call that the egg. So the sperm from the male plant, the male gametophyte, will fertilize the female, and what you get here is the thing that makes the spores. Interesting. It's hardly photosynthetic at all. There's nothing to it. In fact, it doesn't photosynthesize to speak of. It grows up in a parasitic way on the gametophyte generation. This egg, once it's fertilized, will begin to develop, and as the sporophyte zygote begins to grow, you get the stalk, and then inside the capsule is where meiosis will occur. I'll just use a little cursive. I'm so sorry about this, but my stylus does better with cursive. Meiosis, where we'll go from 2 sets of chromosomes to 1 set of chromosomes. There we go. I want to be really clear about that. And what is it that goes to becoming haploid again? Well, when this thing opens up and it lets loose all these little spores, you see all these little haploid spores, and they'll float down to the ground, and they'll end up down here, and they'll grow into, guess what? This structure right here. They'll start asexually dividing, and it will grow up to be a gametophyte again. So the spores are haploid, and they regenerate the gametophyte. So interestingly enough, the gametophytes have to have sex. That introduces some change into the mix, right? You get a male and a female, and they cross their DNA over, and you kind of get a new version of a critter. And then the new critter, the sporophyte, which is growing up on the gametophyte, it just undergoes meiosis and releases spores. So then we get a new gametophyte plant. It's a little bit genetically different. So pretty neat. So this gets broken down into steps. Well, I guess steps in a moment. We'll talk about the types of human use of mosses. Sphagnum moss would be what you would dig up out of a bog. And in fact, sphagnum moss is so acidic that it inhibits the action of bacteria. So I got to show you something really neat right now. Sure, pulling up sphagnum, you can put it in your garden, and it acts as a sponge, and it helps to keep your garden really well hydrated. And you can cut moss up from the ground. It can be used as fuel. And if you've ever gone into a like a story around here, I'd say, for example, like Art Naps, or any place where they're selling gardening supplies, things like that, they'll give you a little disc, and it's sphagnum moss. And what you do is you put your seed in there, and if you keep the sphagnum moss well watered, what will happen is the seedling here in the middle will be very well hydrated, and in fact the seedling will grow up out of the middle of it. So these little discs, these little like peat discs, they're just dried sphagnum, and they turn out to be exceptional ways of growing up plants, little seedling plants. Now, I wanted to show you something that was pretty neat. So I'll pop out. I just have to turn off mirroring. There we go. Okay, so let's go to our browser. I use Photon. A neat little browser I've been using. Okay. And let's look at peat bog, and let's look at a corpse. Now, what was happening was, if someone were put to death or executed, and this could be quite a long time ago, we could talk about the 1400s, 1600s, 1800s, if the body was thrown into a peat bog, it was so acidic that I guess I have to turn mirroring back on, that natural decay processes were slowed down to the point where the body wasn't decomposing properly. It might have gotten a little bit dehydrated, but it's interesting when you look at these bodies and to see what they looked like. In some cases, we were finding corpses like this in a dehydrated state where the rope burned. They found the rope, and they found the marks along the neck. I'm not so sure about this one, but the decomposition is very reduced in the body, it doesn't undergo much natural decay. This is what you would expect to find a little bit more of. Some decay, but not a lot. And there's some very old bodies. And the bodies were found during the excavation of the bogs. And sometimes, even their stomach contents were able to be analyzed. Very low rate of decomp. I think it's exceptional. It's truly a rare find. But I wanted to show that to you because bogs are just so darn acidic. They do a great job of reducing the action of bacteria. Okay, well, that's quick. That took us to the end of human uses of mosses. I had a chance, just a wee chance, to talk about alternation generation here. What I really want to do, I want to show you the animation of alternation generation. This is jumping straight out to a quiz quicker than a hiccup, and that just simply won't do. So I'm going to pop out of the iPad and sort of narrate this for you a little bit. Have this all sort of prepared to go. Life cycle of a moss. So what I'll do is I'll step through it. So you've got a male gametophyte. So if we look up in the top, we're looking at the male reproductive parts, so don't blush. These are called anthers. And the plural of that is antheridia. So meiosis is going on here. We're sort of where I'm tracing with my cursor. And we're getting the production, or sorry, not meiosis. This is already haploid, so I should be clear. It's not meiosis. If you're already haploid, it has to be mitosis because we can't go from N to 1/2 N. That does not work. You have to have at least one set, 1 N, of genetic material. So you're getting the production of sperm here. Now, interestingly enough, that's being produced by mitosis. It's interesting because it's so different from us. So the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte look exactly the same. You wouldn't even know they were any different. Now, it's up in the tip where you'll find the antheridia producing the sperm by mitosis, which is a bit of an exception, as I've said up here. The female gametophyte up here, you will find her, basically her eggs up here. And when they call these the antheridia, the female tip has to have a different name. So we talk about the ancient egg chamber. So they call it an archegonia. Gono means egg and arche means old. So let's get these two together. There we go. So here's the archegonial chamber, and there's an egg right here. And this blue stuff here is water. So it takes a watery environment. It takes a splash to transfer the sperm cells from the male to the female. So you're not going to find moss out in the middle of the Gobi Desert. It just is not going to happen. It's a water-dependent reproductive strategy. So now that the egg has been fertilized, you get the sporophyte, and it begins to grow here. And this is in the tip of the moss. And we saw this as these sort of whisker-like structures. If you ever go out and look at moss, go look for the whiskers sticking up off the green moss. The green part is the gametophyte, and the whisker is basically that's the stalk. And this has a formal name, Calyptra, but that's not really important. What I want you to know is that the spores in here begin to form. You get the capsule, which is now the mature Calyptra. And inside of there, meiosis occurs because this is diploid. Now, something to remember, in the early going of when you look at plants, and these critters like to be haploid. That's where the sexual portion of their life cycle is. This is where the photosynthetic time happens. So that spore will grow up, and what you'll get back to is a full, basically a full critter again. But this time the critter will be a gametophyte, either a male or a female. That's pretty neat. And you're back to this right here. Now, when we examine a fern, it'll be a little more interesting. That's the next phylum we're going to look at. And the neat thing about a fern is that the gametophyte is even more inconspicuous. And I think that's really neat because you start to see the two parts of the life cycle that you never thought that were there. Okay, so we're going to call it for this the introduction to the bryophytes, that alternation generation thing, sporophyte, gametophyte, right? You need to keep that in mind. Now, the videos you need to check out: hornworts, liverworts. I can watch some liverwort reproduction down here. The secret life cycle of bryophytes. That's about 10 minutes, but it's totally worth it. And let's check out these once I have a chance to go over phylum Pterophyta, which is next. Okay, thanks for listening, folks. Moving on.